Hey, it's Ryan, back with another Rune Factory review. This one is obviously very overdue, but here it is. It's been approximately 8 months since I finished Rune Factory 2, so hopefully my memory comes through and I can remember everything about this game so I can review it properly. Now, I had a lot of criticisms of the first Rune Factory game, especially being someone who was used to the quality of life features in the newer entries, but I cut it slack where I could and still had a decently enjoyable experience with the game. Rune Factory 2, however, I had a really difficult time playing through the game, to say the least. Much of its gameplay somehow feels even more dated than Rune Factory 1. So strap in, everyone, because I may end up ripping this game a new one. To anyone who loves Rune Factory 2, I'm sorry if you don't like this video, but it's my opinion on the game. And honestly, it's not all bad. There are some things I think this game did right, and it had a few cool ideas that I honestly would love to see brought back in future Rune Factory games. In case you've forgotten, I've mostly stuck with the newer Rune Factory entries, and I'm going through all of the older entries in release order before Rune Factory 5 comes out. Anyways, let's get started. So this game starts off pretty similarly to the first Rune Factory game, in that you stumble into a village with amnesia and run into a girl. This time, she isn't obsessed with turnips, however, and instead she has a very overprotective father who will accuse you of trying to marry his daughter, even though you've only been talking to her for less than a minute. Yeah, this guy's a little annoying, but he's not that bad, just a little strange. After that interaction, you meet with the rest of the villagers in the town. I do find the villagers in this game to be more interesting than the ones in the first game, but not by that much. Thankfully, they have more dialogue they say each day. Even though most of it is fairly generic, it's an improvement over what the previous game had. One feature I'd love to highlight in this game is its impeccable voice acting. In the first game, the voice acting was fairly generic. It was fine, and it served its purpose, but in this game, however, they really outdid themselves. Here are some examples of the downright legendary voice work that few games managed to replicate.
Is there really a God? How do you know for sure? All right, let's say someone's been attacked and they're too weak to defend themselves. Is your God gonna step in and save them? Whatever. You're just avoiding my questions. I'm out of here. What? Why don't you go outside and see for yourself?
In case you couldn't tell, I was being a little sarcastic, for those who didn't know. Now then, at the start of the game, you have really solid farming tools. Like, the tools are basically what silver farming tools would get you in other Rune Factory games. So that's pretty nice. As dungeon progression goes, yeah, there isn't really any dungeon progression in this part of the game. You have 4 dungeons you can go to at the start of the game, but there isn't much point to venturing through them, because most of the dungeons have fences and large stone tablets that block your way. All the dungeons and monsters are roughly the same strength, and there's no bosses to fight either, so basically there's no point in going to any of the dungeons in the first half of the game, unless you want to grind or something. Just like the last Rune Factory game, they did a pretty good job with the music in this game as well. Some of the songs I enjoyed were the summer theme, Blessia Island theme, Padova Mountain, and Palermo's Shrine. By the way, this song was used like in 90% of Rune Prana in Rune Factory 4 Arc 3. The developers of this game decided to split this game into 2 different generations. In the first generation, your goal is to marry one of the bachelorettes and have a child with them. You are also required to build a school, which requires a lot of money and a lot of materials, so it may take a while to grind for what you need. As for the bachelorettes, none of them really stood out to me that much, but I ended up going with Dorothy, mostly because she's very shy when you first meet her, so I wanted to see how she would come out of her shell and grow as a character. One thing I really like about Gen 1 is how there are rival marriages in it. Some of the bachelorettes will get married to certain bachelors in case you don't marry them in time. Thankfully, the game gives you plenty of time to marry a girl of your choice before they get married. The rival marriages include Jake and Cecilia, Ray and Rosalind, Barrett and Dorothy, and Max and Julia. If you marry one of these people, the bachelor who would usually marry the person you married will just marry someone else. I think this is a pretty cool mechanic, and I'd like to see it come back in a future Rune Factory game at some point. One funny aspect about this is if you wait until a rival marriage occurs, and you happen to have the bachelorette who's getting married at max love points, you can crash the wedding and take her away from whoever she was going to marry in the first place. Yep, everyone just kind of accepts it and moves on, and the girl you stole from your friend just moves in with you. Pretty crazy stuff, I know. This feature is pretty funny in all honesty. I wish there was a bit more dialogue for these scenes though, and again, I do hope this does come back at some point in the future. If these scenes were done properly, they would be very entertaining. But that's where my praise ends, because the first generation of this game is painfully slow to get through. I wish you could at least explore one or two of the dungeons completely, because I often found myself getting bored of doing the same things every day. Basic farming gameplay, talking to villagers who don't usually have the most interesting dialogue in the world, and grinding for materials needed for the school later on takes a while as well. Once you eventually get through it somehow without being bored to tears, you arrive onto the second generation of this game. So, Generation 2. When I first went into this on stream, I thought that I've gone past the slow parts of the game, and now I'd have a lot more fun, seeing as you can finally go through all the dungeons in this game now. Before we get to that, I'd like to talk about what happens at the start of Gen 2. One thing I'd like to mention as well is this is technically the first Rune Factory game where you can choose your gender. You can choose to have a boy or girl when your wife is pregnant, and that is how you choose who you'll be playing as at the start of the second generation. Now, if only you could choose male and female protagonists at the start of the game, but hey, I guess the developers had to start somewhere, right? When you have the school built and you have a child with whomever you married, you, the main character, Kyle, finally regains his memories and remembers why he came here in the first place. He realizes he had a mission he must fulfill, gives his son/daughter an ancient scroll, and just leaves, abandoning his son, daughter, and his wife. Father of the Year award goes to, drumroll please, Kyle! So, what's the second generation like? Well, for starters, the farming in this generation is much worse, due to the fact that the old tools Kyle left behind for Aaron are now rusted, and are basically the cheap farming tools you would typically get in a Rune Factory game. You can upgrade them to better tools later on, of course, but going from silver tier farming tools to cheap tier farming tools is not great. The townspeople in the second generation have much more repetitive dialogue in Gen 2 due to the fact that a lot of them say the same lines over and over. The villagers are certainly worse off in this gen than in the first gen. Another unfortunate aspect I'd like to highlight is how Kyle's wife, or who's now your mom, in Gen 2 says the same thing every day. No change in dialogue whatsoever, at least from what I played. I could be wrong, feel free to correct me on this, but they have one generic sentence they say every day and it never changes. It's quite unfortunate. On the bright side, I do really like how you can see the children that the other villagers had with each other. They're nothing too special, but again, it is really cool to see characters you are familiar with have children and being able to see what they look like, which again, to my knowledge, is only a feature in Rune Factory 2. You can also sort of marry fellow kids that go to the school if you want. It isn't really marriage, obviously, since they're kids, but you can do it if you want. I didn't bother doing this, so I don't really have much to comment on. One exploit that is really funny in this game is the Seed Maker. Seeds in this game cost a decent chunk of money, and are often worth far more than the actual crops themselves. So if you grow and harvest strawberries, for example, and turn them all into seeds, they sell for a lot more than just regular strawberries. You can't do this until Gen 2, but it's a good idea to grow a lot of strawberries in Trieste Forest, since it's spring year-round there. Since Gen 2 mostly starts off like the real beginning of Rune Factory 2, you also can get access to a forge, kitchen tools, crafting bench, and a chemistry set just like in the other games. In order to learn recipes, you have to go through short class lectures done by the teachers. Mana mostly teaches cooking and crafts, whereas Barrett teaches you how to forge weapons and armor. Over time, you'll get more recipes if you do this every day, and eventually finish all of the classes. I think this system works perfectly fine, but I got a little tired of doing these lessons over and over again once I was nearing the end of them. So I believe it's finally time to get to the worst part of Rune Factory 2, the dungeon progression. Now that we're a kid, we can finally pass through the gates. Beforehand, when we were Kyle, we were simply too big to fit through these fences. Now we can! But unfortunately, even though it does open up a decent amount of areas in each dungeon, it does not open up everything. So each dungeon has a boss you need to defeat, and each one gives you a stone tablet. When you talk to Barrett, he will try to decipher the tablets you bring him. He warns you not to put yourself in danger, but seeing as there's 5 dungeons total to complete here, I think there will be plenty of danger coming. Anyways, these stone tablets aren't only dropped from bosses, you also need to obtain them from these statues that are the other obstacle in your path to exploring the dungeons. You need to get every stone tablet from every statue in order to beat the game, so you have to get all of them. How do you get the stone tablets from these statues? By giving these statues random items that are oftentimes difficult or annoying to get. I really dislike this system because all it does is pad out the length of the game. Some of the requirements are ridiculous. On Blessia Island, there's a statue that asks you to grow 6 pineapples and give it to it. Not only do they take 20 days to grow, but the statue only accepts them at night. If you give it to the statue during the day, you gotta grow them again, or better yet, if you miss the statue or drop it on the ground, they're gone. Wait. Actually, there's a lost and found in this game that you can go to for lost items, thankfully. Even though it would be pretty nice if when you drop an item on the ground, it, stays there, and you can pick it back up, but this is still an improvement over the first Rune Factory game, I suppose. So yeah, back to these annoying statues. In Machina Valley, there is one statue that requires you to grow crops in every field in the dungeon, and they must all be fully grown. Thankfully, since you can grow any crop as long as it's an autumn crop, you can use a crop like yams that grow fairly quickly to make this process not too terrible. In order to get to the final dungeon, you need to build all the barns you can, even if you don't need them. Yet another silly requirement needed to progress throughout the game. In the final dungeon, in order to get to the final boss room, you need to grow crops in certain rooms, which can take a long while to finish as well. Yet another way they artificially increase the game's playtime. So yeah, as you can tell, the way the game is structured, dungeons-wise, is very flawed and frustrating. Compared to Rune Factory 1, this game is much worse. At least in that game, there was only 2 dungeons where growing crops was absolutely necessary, and 1 dungeon you could only enter during the winter. I wasn't a big fan of the game doing that, so seeing how Rune Factory 2 handled dungeon progression very badly was disappointing, and honestly, is several steps backwards. Unfortunately, my criticisms don't end there. The combat in this game is another aspect I dislike about this game. One-handed and two-handed sword combat in this game is a lot slower than the first game. The whole combat system feels laggy and slow. It feels like there's a ton of delay between when you press a button and when the action actually happens on screen. This wasn't an issue in Rune Factory 1. Even though the combat was pretty stilted and basic, it had the fundamentals down, and it worked fine for the first game in the series. In this game, however, it was another example of how they regressed from the decent mechanics the first game had. When I played through this game, I exclusively used magic attacks. Since they were very easy to level up, you can literally just throw hundreds of fireballs at your bookshelf to increase your magic skill, and they did pretty good damage, especially with some upgrades later on. Funny how I never bothered with magic attacks in the first game, but in this game I almost used magic attacks exclusively because of how slow sword combat is. Another issue with this game is the frame rate. Most of the time the game runs just fine, but when there is more than say 3 characters / monsters on screen at the same time, the game slows down a ton, becoming a laggy mess. This is not uncommon in other entries, as I distinctly remember this happening in Rune Factory 4 on the 3DS when there was a ton of characters on screen, but usually would only happen in town and not in combat. In this game, sometimes there's a decent amount of characters on screen, and the game slows down a ton. It happened enough that it became a complaint I have with this game. And one monster in particular, the Tundra, lags the game immensely by itself, because it places ice wherever it goes, and those sprites cause a ton of slowdown, which is very annoying, especially since this is in Padova Mountain, a dangerous dungeon later in the game. I believe I remember dying once or twice due to low frame rate caused by these monsters. It's pretty bad. In Rune Factory 1, I can't remember the frame rate ever being an issue for me, but in this game it can be pretty annoying from time to time. None of the bosses in this game pose too much of a threat in my playthrough, some of them only took a few tries before defeating it, even the final boss. Funnily enough, the Crystal Mammoth gave me no trouble in this game, whereas in Rune Factory 4, it was one of the most annoying boss fights in the whole game. Understandably, it was also in Rune Prana. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. Let's get back to talking about Rune Factory 2, shall we? So, the end game. Before you go to the last dungeon, Barret gives you a spell called Dragon Break. This spell is required in order to win against the Elder Dragon. As I previously mentioned, the final dungeon has some issues with padding as you need to grow crops, but other than that, the dungeon isn't too bad. There are some rooms that were challenging, but it wasn't too difficult to get through. When you get to the final boss, the Fire Elder Dragon, Firesome, nice name, is waiting for you. Before the fight, however, Kyle is here, talking to you. He gives you a little pep talk before you fight the fearsome dragon, and then the final battle begins. I didn't have too much trouble with Fearsome, just needed an upgraded water laser magic attack, and that was it. There were a few close calls, however, and it did take me a few tries to beat it, but I did eventually. After the fight, Kyle tells you he can't reunite with you yet. He spent too long with Firesome's spirit, so since you sent Firesome back to the Forest of Beginnings, you have also sent Kyle back there as well. Once this happens, the credits roll. Wait a second. The game is not over yet. In each dungeon in the game, there was an extra room that you couldn't do much in, since you can't enter the dungeons until you beat Firesome for some reason. It plays the Carmite Cave BGM here, and if you go through each one of these dungeons, you can get Kyle back and truly finish the game. But I didn't bother. At this point, I've had it with this game and wanted to move on. My patience can only go so far, even for a series I've enjoyed so much over these years. I was done, and needed to play a different game. I can just look up the ending CG on Google Images and be done with it. I need to move on. This game is the worst game in the series. No wonder there's little to no documented information on this game. Nobody played past Gen 1 because it was so boring, or they got too frustrated with the awful progression of Gen 2, or even the combat. Rune Factory 1 was better, and I bet Rune Factory 3 is too. Every person I know who has played Rune Factory 3 told me they loved it, so I'm looking forward to playing that. But that's for later, as I'm playing this series on release order. My next game I'll be talking about is Rune Factory Frontier, which will take a while, because I still haven't done everything I need to do in that game, so bear with me on that one. You might be waiting a little while for that. Hopefully not as long as this video, though. Despite what I've said so far on this game, I do not think this game is all bad. There are some charming aspects to it I actually really like. The idea of rival marriages is cool, and executed decently well. Most of the townsfolk in Gen 1 is more interested and has more dialogue than in Rune Factory 1, and the idea of having 2 generations is a great idea, but this game did not execute it well. There is a ton of parts to this game that hold it back from getting a recommendation from me, so it won't. Even if you're a diehard fan of the series like I am, I don't think you'll have that much enjoyment out of this game. There is simply too many flaws to make it an enjoyable experience all the way through, in my opinion. One point I'd like to highlight is that the release dates of Rune Factory 1 and Rune Factory 2 are pretty close together. Rune Factory 1 was released on August 24th, 2006, and Rune Factory 2 was released on January 3rd of 2008. That is less than a year and a half. This kind of leaves me to believe this game may have been rushed, perhaps? I have no idea what the history behind this game's development is, but the games releasing so closely to each other could be a reason for why this game has so many issues. Maybe certain elements of this game weren't fleshed out enough. Then again, I could be reading way too into this. Whether I'm right or wrong though, my recommendation for Rune Factory 1 was me stating that for new players, you'd be better off with a newer entry like Rune Factory 4, and for hardcore fans like myself, I could recommend it since I did have fun playing it. This game, however, I really can't recommend to anyone. Except for if you just want to farm and talk to villagers and ignore the combat and story, but at that point, why aren't you just playing a Harvest Moon game? Well, that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and a comment, and share this video as it really helps me out a ton. Anyways, have a good day. I really hope that the Rune Factory Frontier video doesn't take me too long to finish. I don't want to have people wait like 8 months for a next video, because that's like a really long time to wait, so yeah. Don't worry, you won't be waiting that long. If you do, I'm really sorry. But it's gonna come out. It's gonna come out like not too far away from now. I promise.